Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you this morning. I don't know about you, but when I reflect back on the past 11 months since COVID began, one of the things that sticks out at me, one of the weird things, is the combination of the dramatic and the mundane. Somebody recently asked me, sort of casually, what was new with me the other day. And my honest first thought was, well, Miles and I have recently discovered that if we load the round ceramic bowls into the bottom of the dishwasher throughout the day instead of the top rack, that's about 50% more likely that the proportion of top rack dishes to bottom rack dishes will be correct at the end of the day. And then I was like, that is not actually newsworthy information that anyone needs to hear about my life. Actually, I've just spent a year trapped mostly in my house. But of course, all of our lives have had quite a bit of drama in them too in this past year, right? Many of us fled our houses in the middle of the night. There were those apocalyptic days of orange skies and unbreathable air. We've been living under the pressure of a deadly virus in our communities. There's been violent attacks on our democratic election processes and on beyond that. There's plenty that is dramatic, that has been dramatic and newsworthy. And there's plenty that has upended our lives and our understanding of the world. The world is dramatically and irretrievably different than it was a year ago. We will look back on many things this year and remember them vividly, I think, even if it's also a year that has been characterized by the many things that we can't do, and so many more mundane days at home than we might have otherwise chosen for ourselves. I wondered about this strange contrast between the mundane and the dramatic as I read this story of Jesus's transfiguration before the disciples. This is a crucial moment in the Gospel of Mark. It's sort of a pivot point, a fulcrum of the story that's going on. The disciples have been traveling with Jesus for a while now, living their lives with him day by day. And there was certainly plenty of the mundane in their lives together as they walked from place to place, as they ate and drank and learned and went from place to place. And yet, life with Jesus was also full of the dramatic. They saw Jesus heal and teach and do miracles. The disciples have been trying all this time to figure out who Jesus is and what he's about and what it all means, both through the mundane day-to-day walking and through these dramatic events that change how they look at things. And so in the Gospel of Mark, right before this story of the Transfiguration, Peter has a great moment of learning and clarity. He proclaims that he understands who Jesus is, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. It's another pivotal moment. Right afterward, Jesus explains to the disciples what that means, that he's the Messiah. For the first time, he explains it. He explains that it means that he must suffer and die, and that after 3 days, he would rise again. And it becomes clear that the disciples, despite this moment of clarity, still don't fully understand. They're not all the way there yet. Peter rebukes Jesus for saying these things. And perhaps Peter just isn't able or ready to imagine that this Messiah could suffer and be killed. Perhaps he's just not quite ready to go there to understand or imagine that horrible reality. So that's where this story happens. Jesus takes a few disciples up a mountain and they have this incredible encounter. Jesus is transfigured before their eyes and they're able to see him as this dazzling figure, blinding in his brightness, standing with the great prophets Moses and Elijah. This must have been one of those big moments of spiritual, mystical clarity for the disciples. Just as a few moments ago they had been able to understand imperfectly for a moment that Jesus was the Messiah, here they are, just for a moment, able to see him in his glory, the Son of God, robed in dazzling white. standing with the great prophets of their people. For just a moment, they were able to see Jesus as he truly was, to comprehend a bit of this part of his identity as the Son of God. I think it must have been one of those great spiritual moments, perhaps that you've experienced in your life of faith too, those threshold moments. They could peer beyond their current reality to something that was greater than them, something beyond them. It's one of those thin places of transcendence. The language used in this story evokes the great mountaintop story of Jesus and the whirlwind of Elijah. It evokes the dazzling light that blinded and converted Paul. This was a moment of revelation. Like others, when truth was revealed, when God was made known to humans more fully. It's such a powerful moment that it reduces Peter to confusion, even gibberish. He wants to pin it down. He wants to find a way to hold it and stay there. Just so relatable. But the moment ends, as those moments do, and they find themselves standing there together. And they have to go back down the mountain. And as they're going back down the mountain, they don't even get to shout anything about this from the mountainside, about this truth and this experience that they've had. As they've gone down the mountain, Jesus tells them, as he has before, not to tell anybody about this until after the resurrection, which of course is something that they still don't understand. What a strange contrast it must have been after that moment of glory, of revelation, of transcendence, to go back to their dusty walks from place to place, ministering with Jesus in these small towns. Maybe we who are living in the middle of the dramatic and the mundane, the changing of everything in the dishwashers of the world, maybe we can understand a little bit of this, relate to this a little bit in our lives today. As I was seeking to understand how this story might be good news for us this week, I thought of an experience that I had several years ago. It was a difficult time in my life. I was going through a period of stress and grief and anxiety. And I spent a lot of time just walking around my neighborhood, basically just burning off energy and waiting until time had passed, until I had processed some of what I was going through and felt better. A time of stress and grief and anxiety is not unlike the year or so we've had. It has also involved a lot of walks around the neighborhood. So I'm not surprised that I have been remembering a song that was important to me then, but still important to me now. Audrey Assad, who's the songwriter and singer of it, references a poem by Madeleine L'Engle as she sings, "I lift my eyes to the heavens. Nothing sensible has yet appeared in this irrational season. But the light is wilder here, out on the edge of reason. And love burns bright and clear, out where I cannot seize him." The disciples in this story and us right now have a lot that we are trying to understand. This is probably a pivotal moment for us too. Much has changed and much is changing in the world. And I'm willing to bet that many of us have had dramatic moments of clarity and of revelation this year. The ones that I've had have contributed to upending my life, my understanding of things. And yet the world goes on just the same. Our dusty walks continue. It is, at least for me, an irrational season. A time when what used to make sense doesn't anymore. I lift my eyes up, waiting for an easy answer, waiting for something sensible. yet nothing sensible has yet appeared. And yet, out here on the edge of reason, in the place where we cannot seize God or reason God down to size, love burns bright and clear. God's revelation comes even when things don't make sense, perhaps especially when things don't make sense. Perhaps God's revelation comes through more clearly sometimes when we are ready to let in whatever of God's fullness and glory shines through into our humanity, even when it doesn't fit the sensible image of God that we held on to before. And at least in my life, those moments have happened often during times of grief, during times when my world has been upended, when I have been struggling. Maybe when we're desperate for God, we're more likely to accept God, even if God doesn't arrive in the neatly packaged and reasonable and condensed form we would have liked God to arrive in. Perhaps those are moments when we're ready to slow down enough or open up enough to see what really is. My favorite description of contemplation is that it's a long, loving look at what's real. That love is always there, burning bright and clear. But perhaps sometimes we have to step out to the edge of reason to see it. There are many theories about why Jesus in Mark's gospel is so insistent on keeping his identity a secret until later. He tells the disciples many times, don't tell people about this when there's something important that happens. The theory that makes the most sense to me stems from this story of the Transfiguration. That Jesus wanted primarily to point people toward God. And he knew that the disciples would be tempted instead to make him into some version of a human hero. That they'd want to just attract this great cult following of this glorious human. This glimpse of the truth, this revelation came only after the disciples had begun to open themselves to the impossible and irrational possibility that Jesus was the Messiah. But Jesus cautions them that it won't be until after the resurrection that they can fully proclaim this truth, tell the irrational story of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. I think this moment, too, they must have been at the beginning of grief. Jesus had just told them that he was going to die on the cross. And they didn't know what that meant yet, but they must have been just start to have an inkling. And there in their grief, just a little bit more of the truth comes to them as they continue this journey. But what this whole long arc of the Gospel of Mark tells us, and we're about to go into this final arc and go with the disciples and Jesus to Jerusalem and go to the cross during this season of Lent. What this gospel seems to be telling us is that we have to travel the whole dusty and painful and bewildering path with Jesus. Days and days of walking together, the mundane, as well as the dramatic big moments. And resurrection, like the rest of it, is perhaps something that the disciples and all of us had to experience in order to believe. We have to live through these irrational seasons, travel through them step by step, knowing that the bright love of God is there to guide and to warm us. I reminded the children this week in a video about getting ready for Lent, and I'll remind you too that the whole point of Lent is, I think, about getting ready to enter the great mystery of life and death that we experience in a special way in the stories and rituals that surround Holy Week and Easter. I don't think Lent is primarily about gaining holiness or self-improvement or dieting or whatever we tend to make it into. It's about realigning ourselves with and recommitting to being on this journey with Jesus. A journey that contains glorious moments like the Transfiguration, that ends in the cross, that goes beyond it. The ending is not the ending, it goes beyond it to the resurrection, to the life that conquers death. It's a path that we only come to understand as we travel it. And I think we're at a moment in the world in this year, as in the weird Lent of 2021. I think we're especially invited this year to get ready to see things how they really are, to be open to that mystery, that truth, even if that truth is difficult, even if it seems horrible and full of grief, just like the disciples coming to terms with the cross, even if it defies reason. We're invited to see truths in our communities, even when they're difficult, and to imagine ways to live together that might have defied sensibility before. And I think this Lent, this year's Lent, we're invited to do that in ways that respond to the dramatic events of this year, and that respond also to the mundane and strange day-to-day of our lives. Both of those responses can help us prepare to encounter the great mysteries that are before us. And if you're not sure what that means for you, maybe that sparked an inkling of an idea of how you might get ready for the mystery. But if you're not sure, I actually think we've got some good tools this year. It's been cool to see different threads and different ideas popping up. Deacon Susan and several others from our churches in the Napa Valley are leading a contemplative course in the weeks ahead that will invite us to gaze upon images of Jesus in the stories of this season. What better way to realign and recommit to that journey with Jesus? And Reverend Robin from St. Mary's and I are leading a class on the concrete and practical tools that can help us to build communities that can do this big transformative work together. I think it'll be a class that brings together the small and the mundane practices together with the capacity for dramatic action that responds to these big moments of change that we're in. And beyond that, we have opportunities to meditate together, to create art together, to pray together. And there may be other things that speak to you as well as you consider this season of preparation. It doesn't have to be something fancy or big or perfect. It's about turning toward that truth and that revelation that Jesus offers, being willing to go on that path, up the mountain to what's glorious in this spiritual life, and down the mountain to the cross, and then beyond to new life. In this irrational season, out on the edge of reason, where our senses feel strange and the world is hard to understand, love burns bright and clear. We cannot seize God, but God is with us, revealing God's self to us in new ways still.